Good afternoon. This is the podcast Life Along the Merrimack, and I am host Dyke Hendrickson. We often talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River, but we are flexible and at times other subjects are discussed. Today we will visit with a successful author, Holly Robinson. She lives locally and knows a lot about publishing and actually knows quite a bit about the river. Holly, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
One question I'm always curious about is how, guests actually got to Newburyport. Where did you grow up, Holly, and how did you find your way to the Newburyport area?
I grew up all over because my dad was a Navy captain. And when I first came to Newburyport, I was pregnant with my first child, and my brother brought me here for lunch. We had lunch at the Grog. Mm-hmm. And I walked through the town, and I had been in Europe just before that, and I just absolutely fell in love with Newburyport because it had the in street where the playground is. All of the children were there, the parents were out there drinking coffee, and I thought this is like a little tiny European city, and I absolutely fell in love with the town at that moment and thought, okay, I'm going to live here in this area. So I have ever since.
Well, it is a good choice. My wife and I had a similar situation. We were living in Lexington, Mass., which we did not think was very cool. We came up here. We heard this is the last place you could buy a mansion for $150,000. So we said, a mansion for $150,000. Sure, let's go do it. Well, of course, there are no mansions on High Street for $150,000, but we were here, went to the Grog, went to Plum Island, had a great time, and so we're similar to you. We were very impressed. But I think, as you look upon your background, I think your grandparents were early settlers along the Merrimack River, or at least in some of the industries. Can you talk about how your grandfolks got here? And I think they were involved in industries along the Merrimack River.
I had a great-grandfather who was a wool sorter in the mills in England, and back then that was kind of a prize trade for the fabric mills that were starting here in the United States to compete with the mills in Europe. They wanted to produce linens locally, fabrics locally, and so he was brought here and worked in, among other places, worked in Haverhill. And so the goods, as you know, historically were shipped by boat along the Merrimack River to Newburyport to be sent out for sale to Europe. And he worked there, and then my grandfather worked in one of the big Woolworth stores that was in Haverhill originally. So my family kind of originated in that area, and that's what first drew me to the history of the Merrimack River. And I lived in a house in Byfield that had an old snuff mill behind it, and I started researching the history of the snuff mills in this area. And so one of my early novels, my second novel, The Wishing Hill, has a historical story that takes place at that snuff mill, and the river features prominently in the book.
Well, there are a lot of intriguing industries along the river over the years. At the Custom House Maritime Museum, where I am the outreach historian, they have a great presentation now on pottery that was created here in the Merrimack River area. And sometimes I know you've had a number of books that you've authored. Have you been able to use the river, not as a character, as people say, but has it been a locale in some of your stories?
Yeah, most of my books are set around here. I have 6 novels that have been published, and 5 of them are set here. And my characters are always doing things on the river, just watching the eagles or rowing boats or sailing. There's a lot of activity along the river because my characters are right around here. Yeah.
Well, the age-old question is, what inspires you to write a full-length book? And so I guess that's my question. You've had 5 or 6. You also wrote a book that I'd like to talk about. You were the daughter of a gerbil breeder, and that has its own funk to it, which we will get to.
Yeah, it's a gerbil farmer, we like to say, but yes, yeah. The gerbil czar is what my dad called himself.
All right, well, let's talk about the gerbil czar first.
Okay, so my first published book was actually a memoir called The Gerbil Farmer's Daughter. And
what year was that, would you think?
I think it was published in 2009. Yeah, and it was. I wrote it because why not? My father was was in the Navy for many years, and then somehow in the middle of the Mediterranean got the idea to raise America's newest pet, is what he hoped it would be. So he started raising gerbils in our garage, and it just grew from there. So he ended up with a farm with 9,000 gerbils in central Massachusetts.
Well, years ago there was a TV show called What's My Line, where people would have to guess what the person did for a living. And I would think gerbil farmer could have been in there.
He might have fooled them.
For a tough call.
Yeah.
Are gerbils nice? I mean, did you enjoy working with gerbils?
Yeah, they're nice. They're easy to handle as long as you're gentle with them, like with any animal. And they're easier in some ways because if they escape, they have tails, so you can grab them. But yeah, no, they're great. They're great pets. Yeah.
So did he sell them wholesale? Did he sell them?
All different ways. His gerbils, he was really hoping they would go to space. They never did. But he sold them to universities. He sold them to pet shops. Some of them, gerbils are one of the few mammals that have seizures, like epileptic seizures, naturally, like humans do. And so a lot of them were used in brain research for that purpose. So that's how his business grew to be so large.
So that there must have been quite a bit of science to it, because
Sure.
I've been to some of the mice the mice retreats up in Bar Harbor, Maine, where they have some of the largest controlled breeding of mice for medical. And so this must be similar to that, where he had to have, stringent conditions for raising them before he could sell them into the medical field.
Right. You have to keep the genetic lines pure so you know what you're getting when you start an experiment. For an animal lover like me, it was a tough childhood in some ways when I realized what he was doing. But I also had a sister who died of a genetic disease, so I could also see the balance, well, it would be nice if they would find a cure for these diseases.
How long did the farm go on, Holly?
He had it, I think about 20 years, probably.
Where was it located?
Yeah. It was in West Brookfield, Massachusetts. Yeah.
And how did it all end?
He sold it when he retired. He sold it. He sold it to Charles River Laboratories, which is in Wilmington. Yeah, it was a really big laboratory facility.
Well, does it ever take you a while? I remember when I, was reading your bio some years ago, and I read that the entree, I should say, and it didn't hit me that this was literally the daughter of a gerbil farmer.
Thought I was making it up.
Well, you're a fiction writer, so
yes, true. Yeah.
But did that take a moment to explain to people what it was? Because I didn't get it the first time.
No, as I put it, I think in the introduction, usually my brother and I didn't tell anyone because it would always just provoke more questions than answers. So we didn't really tell anyone at all about it until I was older and realized I could write about this. Yeah.
Well, they always say write about what you know.
Yeah, there you go.
You seem to be an expert on gerbils.
Yeah.
You mentioned fiction, and you've had 5 or 6 novels. And this is a question I always hear different answers to, but I love to ask the question. When you start a story which turns into a novel, do you initially focus on the plot or the characters, or how does it play out in your creative space?
Writing isn't really magic, as Anita Diamond just came and spoke to the writers group here in Newburyport, and she reminded us that it's not magic, it's work and sweat. But I would say that I don't really think of novel ideas. I would say they come to me, and so that sounds sort of woo-woo magical, but the reality is I'll hear about a situation like my mom used to tell this story about a child she babysat for, and she would tell this story when we were kids to keep us quiet in the backseat of the car because it was kind of a creepy story. She said, I was babysitting for this family, and the parents told me the children are asleep. I should just do homework at the kitchen table and don't go in the back bedroom at the end of the hall. So, of course, being 12 and the youngest of, two brothers, and she immediately went down to the end of the hall and opened the door that she wasn't supposed to open, and this child came running out, this other child she didn't even know was in the house, and he was deaf and blind probably, and making animal sounds. He was this feral child. She was terrified, and we were always like, well, who was it? Whose child was it? What happened to him? What did you do? And she said, well, I just called my mother, and we put him back in the room and locked it again. And that was the end of the story. And I always wanted to know the end of that story, and so I made it up. And that was Beach Plum Island. That turned into a novel, my 3rd novel. He's a character in my novel. So when I overhear stories at restaurants or something jumps out of the newspaper, any of those things can become novels if you just let it come to you.
You've spoken at the Newburyport Literary Festival, and I think you attend as well.
Yes.
But just as a general element, because some people are not so familiar with it, is the festival helpful for writers, or is it helpful for listeners, or who benefits, and how did this come to be in terms of drawing several thousand people each April?
Well, I credit your wife for a large part of that.
So my wife is Vicki Hendrickson,
and Jennifer
and she's the founder of it. Okay.
Jennifer Entwistle.
Sometimes I ask a simple question to get things going, even if I know the answer. Please, Holly, continue.
Your wife's best PR guy, and Jennifer Entwistle, and the people, the volunteers, the many volunteers. So they have helped to build it what it is. And who do I think benefits from it? I think everyone. Certainly writers benefit from it because it's very rare. I mean, people think, oh, it must be so exciting to be a writer. In fact, no. We sit in our pajamas usually, or sweatpants if it's a really high fashion day, and we'll sit at our computers for hours. Like I can be at my computer for 10 hours and get up to walk the dog. That's about my only social activity. So to come into a place where you see other writers speaking and talking about the craft of writing, and you get introduced to books you didn't know existed, or you hear how a writer solves certain plot issues or character issues, it's amazing for writers. And so it draws all kinds of writers. And then for readers also, same thing. Readers love to get together and talk about books and to meet the people. I mean, we think of books when we go to a bookstore. A lot of people just say, oh, there's the book. It's a beautiful cover. There it is, all finished. That's not really how they start out, and for readers to hear that process, I think it's really great. Also talk about books together. And then for the town, I mean, for Newburyport, it really has helped put Newburyport on the map. Newburyport's always been an artsy place. There have always been artists here, but now it's a literary place. We have the wonderful Jabberwocky Bookshop, which you can't miss if you're in this area, and then these writers come here every year and thrill us. It's
well,
great.
I was a bit chagrined when the Book Rack recently closed. That's on this corner of State Street in Pleasant, and had been there for several decades. And that was an unfortunate thing, but Jabberwocky is still around.
Yeah, going strong.
I understand it's for sale, Holly. You could buy it if you wanted to. Ann Patchett, the great novelist, owns a bookstore in Nashville.
She does, yeah.
But tell me, is it harder to sell books these days than, say, 10 years ago when you may have been getting your early books out?
It's harder and easier. Harder in that there's a lot of competition for entertainment. I mean, look at all the various streaming services that you can, bring movies and TV shows right into your home, like willing and binge watch whatever you want. There's a lot of great computer games, so there's a lot of competition for our at-home entertainment now. But it's easier to sell books in some ways because there are so many publishing platforms. I'm published traditionally. My books, I self-published one novel, and then the rest.
How did that go? Did you enjoy that experience?
Loved it. Yeah, I loved it, and it was like a mini MBA on how to market your books. Because you had to do it you have to do it all yourself when you self-publish it. You're your own marketeer. But then the rest of my novels have been with Penguin, and so. That's one way you can go. You can go the traditional route. But
do you have an agent?
Yes.
Are agents helpful?
You can't really sell to one of the traditional big publishers without an agent because they get so many submissions that they only look at agented work usually. So yeah, they're very helpful. But if you can't go that route or don't want to go that route because it is very time consuming, you need to find an agent first, then find the publisher, and it can take years. You can self-publish. There are so many boutique publishers that are kind of in between. They do all the work for you, but you're still paying for it and self-publishing, but you keep more of the profits. Or you can completely independently self-publish. So there's so many different ways to get your work out there.
Well, one of the benefits nowadays, if you go back 2 or 3 decades, perhaps, you'd have a publisher, even if it's local, and you'd have to have a number of books. Like you have to do 5,000 books because we don't want to do the run. For too small. But now, as you know, some of the publishers will maybe come out with only 500 or 900 books, and then, they're all geared up, in their computer to hit the button and do 500 more almost overnight. So
right.
I think this must be a benefit for authors too. So, you don't have to think 5,000 to 10,000 the first time out, but if
No.
it does move, they can do a reprinting much easier than they did in the old days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Are there any authors that are known, to be North Shore authors? I mean, maybe John Marquand a couple decades ago could be one. Are there people known for writing about the North Shore?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Andre Dubus, our own literary icon here, his dad, Andre Dubus III, he was amazing, located right here in Haverhill. Then John Updike, of course, Beverly Farms and Ipswich. Going back a bit farther, H.P. Lovecraft, an amazing science fiction writer, mostly Ipswich. Susan Minot is Manchester. So there's dozens. Yeah.
You know who's
hundreds probably that I'm just not thinking of right now.
Whose books I used to read were Kenneth Roberts. He wrote a book called Arundel, which albeit is set in Maine, but nevertheless, a lot of it started in Newburyport. And he also lived here for a while when he was with Boston newspapers. And if you really go back and stretch the definition, William Lloyd Garrison was one of our first writers. He was a newspaper guy. Of course, he was an activist against slavery, of course, but he had a newspaper. He was thrown in jail for his newspaper, as a matter of fact. But I suppose that, if you go back, there's...
John Greenleaf Whittier, he was also an abolitionist and a poet in Amesbury, so he was very well known at the time as one of their fireside poets in the 1800s. And here, we have so many contemporary writers where you think of Meg Mitchell-Moore or Anne Easter Smith. There's so many contemporary novelists. Jonathan Kozol, if you want to read about education, he was right here in Georgetown. So, yeah.
Irina Espaillat is a poet and bilingual. She's from the Dominican Republic, but, she travels the country. She speaks in many places. I understand a street has been named after her in Dominica. And so I've heard her speak numerous times with poetry, and, she's really an asset to the community as well.
Yeah.
I recently... and another local person in a different sense is Gwyn Woodworth. I don't know if you know that name.
No.
She's a historian. About a decade ago, she wrote a book called Tiptoeing Through the Tombstones.
Oh, right. I do remember that book, yeah.
In which her father actually was one of the lead mortuary owners in town, and he actually owned part of one of the cemeteries, so she grew up with tombstones. Some people dream about, when they can't go to sleep, they dream about sheep jumping over fences. She probably dreamed about, uprighting tombstones because her whole life, early life. But she wrote a book. It did very well, won some honors, and she's about to come out with another book about Newburyport history.
Yeah.
So that's exciting.
Yeah.
Do you have a project underway right now? Or
I do, yeah.
Maybe you can talk. I think authors don't like to say too much about what they're doing, but if you can divulge a little about what's going on.
Well, I will say it's my first work of historical fiction, and it just about broke me. If I had known how much work it was going to be ahead of time, I might have, tried to dissuade myself from doing this particular thing, but it happened because of John. I went to John Greenleaf Whittier's home in Amesbury, and on his wall I saw it was a print of a painting by the American Impressionist Childe Hassam, if you know who that is. And it was a painting of Celia Thaxter in her garden. And Celia Thaxter, and I had no idea who this person was. And I asked the docent there, who is this woman in this beautiful white dress in this garden with all these hollyhocks? And she said, that's Celia Thaxter. Like, who? She said she was the most famous woman writer in New England in the 19th century. I had no idea who she was. So I started doing research, and it's almost as if that woman climbed out of the painting and got in the back seat of my car with me, because you asked me how people get ideas for their books. She came home with me, and I started researching her. So the book that I just turned into my agent, and fingers crossed, features Celia Thaxter as a character. And it's set from 1878 to 1895 largely on the Isle of Shoals, some in Boston, some in Paris. Yeah.
Well, that must have been exciting.
It was.
So.
Yeah.
Did you create other characters,
yes.
or were you able?
So it's interesting writing historical fiction. I kind of was feeling my way along, and of course, doing way too much research. You read a stack of books as tall as you are, and you know this. You've written a lot about history, and you use maybe 4 sentences out of like 700 books, but you need all of that background, and you need to let it gel, and then you need to write the book, and then you need to rip out most of the research that'll make the readers bang their head on it. You have to just say, okay, that's not useful. Just a little fact here and there is enough. But you have to do the research to write the book. And now I forgot your question.
Yeah, and just, if you had the lead character, but
yes,
for secondary characters,
yes. So
were they real people, or did
some
you
were real
them?
people, and then I had some that were. The way Anita Diamond put it to me was they have to be plausible, like people who could have existed in that time. So I based one of my main characters on a watercolorist, a woman painter who existed at that time, and I gave her some of her life, but I made up a lot of her life. But she could have existed. And then I had other characters that were real life historical figures, like Child Hassam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this is the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson, the host. I'm speaking with author Holly Robinson. And, congratulations on finishing that. Is that a great relief, or,
no.
Is it just...
No, it's just, I know it's the first of many, many steps. I hope the agent takes it. I hope the agent sells it. I hope the editor doesn't make me write it all over again. I hope the copy editor isn't too difficult. There's all of these steps to getting a book published. I hope it comes to life, because I put a heart and soul into this book. I hope it'll, exist.
Well, I have a book that's finished and creating some frustration for me. It's called New England Coast Guard Stories. And I travel from northern Maine to southern Connecticut, interviewing coasties of all rank.
So are they all contemporary stories, or is there a lot of history in there too?
Well, there is a lot of history, because my inspiration was that Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard in 1790.
Yeah.
And Alexander Hamilton, who in recent years is becoming a household name, although it certainly wasn't before that, was the father of the Coast Guard. So that's the history I have. And then I have about 20 or 25 interviews with Coast Guard personnel. Why did you join? What have you found? And, and almost to a point, to a person, they said, I wanted to help people, and I wanted to do something for my country. And then kind of under their breath, a few of them will say, but I didn't want to shoot anybody or get shot at.
Yeah, well,
so, that's legitimate.
Reasonable, yeah.
So, and, I actually interviewed, he's a captain of a vessel, 100-footer, and he said, I was in the Navy for 3 years, but not enough happened in the Navy. In the Coast Guard, you go out every day, something happens.
Sure.
And on his last trip, to the Caribbean and actually to Southern California, they came back with like 6 tons of cocaine and a lot of other illegal drugs.
Gosh.
So, he is in harm's way.
Yeah.
All those boats, that they stop have guns on them. You have to treat it. But so these are some of the stories about New England Coast Guard stories.
Well, that's a whole other craft, isn't it? Right? I do that too as a ghostwriter, especially, and as a journalist. But being able to interview people, get those stories, and the stories they tell you are always kind of big and amorphous, and then you have to, as the writer, gel them down into something that'll fit on the page, A, and B, be interesting to read, right? So hats off to you to be able to do that.
Well, that's true, and so I started by saying my frustration is I had everything sent in last December, and everything means the text, 60 photos, the captions.
Yeah.
So, for a long time, I would call up and say, what is the publishing date? Because I had a contract. This was not into the wind. And he said, geez, we publish 400 titles a year. What are you yapping about? Anyway, so I finally wrote a letter to the CEO of the company, which is far below his pay level to listen to me. But, then later that same day, I got a note from this cranky editor who said, oh, gee, I think we'll do it in March.
Good for you.
So to the CEO,
congratulations.
I said, I'm not a rube. I've been through this before, but I don't have an editor. I don't have a date. And did someone there die? I mean, does no one work in the afternoon? Anyway, so we won't go into my elements, but that should be...
Well, congratulations on finishing the book.
Should be coming out in March. But you mentioned some freelance writing and some ghost writing. Can you talk a little about what is ghosting? And you might not want to talk too much about it, but maybe you could talk a little about this area.
Yeah, well, being a ghostwriter is a great way to make a living. Basically, you take stories from all kinds of people. I find them through, sometimes publishers contact me directly. Editors will contact me directly. Sometimes I work for one agency that specifically puts together ghostwriters with clients who are looking to have books written, and then I also get them through my own literary agent. And sometimes people just contact me out of the blue, just online. They find me online because I'm a ghost. They Google ghostwriters in Massachusetts or something, and they find me. So
are these 80,000 word tomes, or would they be 20,000?
Well, 80,000 words wouldn't really be a tome. That would be more like 200. But anyway, yes, sometimes they're books. Most of the time they're books. Most of the time they're memoirs. Sometimes they're not, though. Sometimes I'm ghostwriting, like right now, a book about learning disabilities, and it has parent stories and solution problems and how to frame the problem, solutions for working with school districts. So it's more like a big journalism project. Sometimes they're memoirs for actors, singers, people who have come back from the dead, whatever, and they're all fun because I get to, for a fiction writer, it's a dream come true because you get to go into other people's lives and live them.
So is this a situation that takes, say, 6 weeks or a year or?
Well, I would say anywhere from 6 months to a year for a book. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But your name, does it appear on the book? Or?
Not usually. Usually I might be in the acknowledgments. Occasionally it's, so-and-so with Holly Robinson. But usually if you're a ghostwriter, you're really a ghost. You're not. When you think of all the memoirs that have come out, I don't know, Demi Moore's, or most people don't even talk about their ghostwriters. They just talk about how they wrote the books. But every one of those celebrities had help, either in the form of a writing coach, or usually, I've done everything from take a messy manuscript and fix it, rewrite it, to writing it from the ground up through interviews, the way you would any kind of a magazine article.
Do you still work for magazines, or? Well, I won't say newspapers. I'm a former newspaper person, and that field is disappearing fast.
Well, I mean, I write for Cognoscenti, which is that WBUR, that NPR platform. I write for women's magazines, the ones that still exist. I occasionally write for them. I used to write for a lot more, of course, because more were in existence. I used to be a contributing editor for Parents Magazine and for Ladies Home Journal, for those kinds of magazines, and I loved writing for them too. I mean, I think I love writing, so it really doesn't matter what I'm writing. And I'm lucky because I've been able to figure out a way to make a living as a writer. And the best way to make a living as a writer is to be flexible and really just be ready to write anything that comes your way. And then you can make a pretty decent living as a writer.
Well, things have changed so much, obviously. I reread a biography of Scott Fitzgerald recently, and he was writing in the 20s and early 30s for magazines. He would get $2,000 and $3,000 a story in the 20s and 30s, and
it was a fortune back then. Yeah,
it was a fortune. It was a fortune back then.
I don't think the rates have gone up much from there.
Well, if you get $2,000, but it is a situation that's changed quite a bit. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm talking with Holly Robinson, and we only have a couple minutes to go, Holly. It always goes fast.
That went by really fast, yeah.
Your answers have been wonderful, and I've learned a lot. Do you have an idea now for another book, or are you just taking a breath for the moment? And
well, I mean, I have ghostwriting projects ongoing, so I'm always writing. I always have another idea. I have actually two books. Two. I've started them both, and I'm just waiting to see where they go, and they're very different. One is a YA novel, and one is a thriller. Who knows?
Do you? But in these cases, would you query your agent to say, "I'm thinking about this"? Do you have thoughts?
No, I might. If we have lunch, I might chat with her about it. But I don't query officially until I'm farther along, until I know which one I want to work on. Because you really need to have that fire in your belly for a project. If you're going to stay the distance with a book, you really better love what you're writing. Yeah.
Well, your historical fiction sounds fascinating. It must still be with you, because
it is.
You recently finished, but beyond that,
I just turned it in last week.
That's right.
It's
you
very
haven't
recent.
gotten all the green lights that you must.
Nope. And there's that feeling when you're a writer of feeling kind of bereft when you don't have that escape portal to go through anymore, because the book is off and you can't do anything else with it. So there's that bereavement period, I think, and so you better have another project waiting in the wings to get you through.
Well, for my Coast Guard book, I did feel bereavement for a while, and then it turned into frustration and then near anger. So I have different emotions. Well, we just have about 30 seconds left, Holly. Maybe you can talk about, do you have advice for young people or older people if they wanted to get into writing, maybe writing their own story?
Sure.
We always hear everyone has at least one story in them, their own. How
That's
would
true.
one
And-
get started?
Well, I mean, I tell everyone to either join. There are lots of workshops that are either free, like through libraries, or through the Newburyport Adult Education Center, fairly reasonably priced. Grove Street in Boston. So I say sign up for a class and find a group that you can work with, because that'll give you deadlines and an audience.
You know, deadlines are
Yeah,
important. I
yeah.
say that I'm a journalist, but even writers such as yourself, I
Yeah.
mean, you read romantic stories about a novelist missing his deadline by 6 months, but that shouldn't happen anymore.
Yeah, if you do that in my business, you won't stay employed.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. Holly Robinson, a local writer. She writes historical novels. She writes novels and ghostwriting. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. This is Life Along the Merrimack. We will be back next week. Thank you.